As Fred said, I'm head of IT at the Zoological Society of London. I'll try and make this sound slightly more exciting than it does. It sounds a little dull, but there are two components to it. One is really about a process, which is more about a feeling process, and the other is more about tailoring things to suit what you want. Just to give you a bit of context, I'm going to be talking generally about the Zoological Society's transition of ticketing systems from the previous version of Patronage, which some of you will know, some of you won't know, Patronage Online, to the new version called SRO4, which is a sort of upgrade. So it's from the same vendor, but it's a sort of new system, but it's an upgrade. So there's some interesting learnings from that. ZSL, most of you probably think of ZSL as London Zoo. You might think Whipsonade Zoo if you know a bit more about us, but you probably don't know much about what else we do. That's our mission statement, is actually to promote and achieve worldwide conservation of animals and their habitats. Essentially our mission as an organisation is to save the planet, so it's quite broad, it's quite challenging, and we have a diverse organisation. And I think it's that diversity that has kept me there for 13 years. Some might argue it's probably time I moved on, but actually we've changed a lot over the time I've been there. And it's important really that you understand how the society is made up. We're an odd organisation. I don't know Game of Thrones, some of you probably do, but I'm told there are lots of different houses in there who are always warring and fighting. Someone made an analogy the other day that this is how our organisation works. So essentially we've got London Zoo, Whipsonade Zoo, as I mentioned. Then we have the Institute of Zoology. So we're unique in the sort of Zoological Society world by having a formal HEFCE-funded academic organisation attached to us. We have about 100 scientists, we have PhD students, we have MA students, we have laboratories, we do all sorts of strange genetic research, and we do quite a lot of work in the veterinary field as well, which crosses over with the zoos. But that's a whole different culture. So again, I'm going to put quite a lot of emphasis as I talk to you about culture and planning. So London Zoo, Whipsonade Zoo, visitor attractions, but also doing conservation, lots of people, lots of things going on, Institute of Zoology. And then this other bit here, which is even less known, is our Conservation Programmes Department. And this has really grown since I've been there, from being a few people to now having an organisation, a global organisation, where we work around the world, and we have somewhere in the region of about things going on, I'm told, in about 40 countries, but our key countries are probably about 10. But there's quite a nice picture there that just shows you where, and that's from our last annual report, where we do some of our work. So on the one hand, I'm supporting people out in the field. I'm increasingly now trying to look at how we provide IT resources and services to this lot, who up until now have been very under the radar and invisible, and I'm looking from the commercial side how we get in our money that supports a lot of this. So putting this into the business context, the key driver for anything we do at the moment, and certainly ticketing systems, which is what I'm going to come back to, are our 1.8 million, 1.9 million visitors a year. So nearly 1.2 million come to London, and 600,000 just over 600,000 go to Whipsonade. We've got 114,000 members, so those are people who take out membership, have a membership card, come to either zoos, get benefits and so forth in the shops. And all that lot produces about £33 million of income in relation to our £55 million turnover as an organisation. The difference between the two is made up of catering and retail systems, probably add another £10 million in there, and then HEFCE grants and other funding for the rest of the organisation. So we're quite a big organisation. Operationally, this is 364 days a year. We don't stop for anything. We're open all the time. We're open from 10 in the morning till 6 at night most of the time. So like most of you probably actually work evenings, a lot of you, where I don't, so I'm spared that. Although we do now do zoo lates and various other things in the evenings as well. So that's the context of where our ticketing is, or was. Just to give you a bit of background, what I'm going to roughly go through is the project that we embarked on a couple of years ago. We had, probably like you, a situation where we had a ticketing system that was reaching the end of its supported life. The business was demanding that they wanted to do all sorts of new products and services that we couldn't necessarily deliver with what we had. And we were looking to think about what are the next steps. So on the one hand, we had the option, throw it all out and start again, and on the other hand, we had, well, there's a product called SRO4 that's an upgrade, might that not do what we want? The other issue that we had at the time was we had Patronage doing the ticketing, we had Razor's Edge doing our fundraising, and we were using Artifacts, which is a room booking and resource booking for a lot of our education rooms and spaces and so forth. So again, we also wanted to look at how we could rationalise some of that. So the challenge we had really in the first stage was to say, do we throw the lab start again, or do we go with SRO4? And we had to come up with a process and a way of being happy that whatever decision we made was going to be the right one, without getting so tied up in the decision-making process that we never made a decision. Even though we did make a decision to review the process, we still took 20 months from starting that to going through to actually going live with what we had. How did we do it? What did we go through? What sort of things were we looking at? I think this is where I use the word design a process. Now, there are lots of project managers and lots of people who know project methodologies. There are probably lots of rules and framework. Well, there are, because I've seen them and I use them. But for me, being responsible for delivering this whole piece for the organisation. So it's not just the technology, it's actually thinking how it fits within the whole organisation and how the organisation can cope with it. Design was an important word for me to use, and it's one that I use with a bit of emotion in it and a bit of feeling. And I know as IT people we don't sometimes like that, we like straight lines and boxes to join things up. But for me, it was really important to think about what the whole piece felt like. In the original discussions I had with Fred talking about this, we said, I think it was designing an effective tendering process for a new system. And when I sat down and thought about it, I thought, well, tendering is actually just one very small part of this. The whole process to get you from A to B, you're going to involve project managers, you're going to have lots of structure and all the rest of it, but actually before you get to that point, you've got to think about what it's going to look like and how you, if you're responsible for delivering this, are going to make it work for the business. So some things that I just wanted to throw out, and I'll just touch on some of them because there will be a plethora of other things. I can't distill a lifetime of project management and methodology or experience into sort of 5-minute talk, but I've picked out here what I think are some of the key questions we went through. There's the whole question you need to decide at the beginning as to whether you're going to stay with a package that you're managing in-house, or could you give it to someone else and outsource it. That comes with all sorts of pros and cons. For us it wasn't to be the right route, we decided to keep in-house. The other thing you need to be cognizant of, I think, is these processes are expensive and timely, and you have to move with the business. So it's no good kicking off something, and perhaps we should, with hindsight, be more realistic about the time scales. It took us 20 months, but that cost money and took time. So before you start this thing, you've got to have a sense of how you're going to get to the end, and know what that journey is going to be. I think some other things that are important to me are who runs the project. Again, depending on the scale of your organisation, you're going to have a vendor who's going to say to you, we'll do it all for you, that's easy, yes, of course we can do it, tick, 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 here's the bill, we'll come in and do it. How much do you want to let them do that? How much do you want to train and build up in-house capacity? How much capacity do you have to do that to actually allow you to then take ownership of that solution and configure it for your future requirements? So that's quite a big decision, and again, there are costs involved with that. But you've got to have a feel for how, once you've gone live, this thing is going to be yours rather than the vendor's. Dates and milestones and learning from previous projects, fairly obvious things, but I think just as an observation, we sketched out critical dates, and we had a particular end date, which 2 years out or 18 months or a year out from when it was, seemed okay. As we got nearer, we realised we hadn't left quite enough room between that and go live, so actually we had to do some jiggling. With hindsight, we should have seen that, but it did affect some of the tasks we did. And there were some other dates that crept on us that we should have known about that we didn't. So there were some governance dates with our council that we sort of thought we got right, but then they changed them, and that had an impact on the project. So again, this is all part of what you need to be thinking about and feeling about. Have escape routes along the way. I think one of the key things for us before we committed was to make sure that we didn't spend a fortune going down any one route and then get to the point where we went, whoops, this isn't right for us. So we tried to do things in bite-sized chunks before we got to commissioning and saying go for anything, and I'll mention that a bit more. And the final sort of piece that I think I want to emphasise, I mean, I've been with the zoos for 13 years, so I know their culture fairly well. I would suggest, from what I know of other organisations and ours, we do things differently from the way other people will. I know we do them differently here from the way I did them in other organisations. If I'd taken a textbook answer that said do A, B, C, it wouldn't necessarily worked in our organisation without modifying it to A, B, D, C, or changing it. So I'm sure you know your organisation very well, but do be aware, again, as project managers and planners, understand that culture, know what your capacity is as an organisation for change. There's no point in starting on a major change journey if the organisation isn't used to it or hasn't really signed up for it or doesn't quite understand what's going to do. A couple of other things we'll pick up at the end: data conversion reporting. I'm sure you will scratch over those things, but I'll mention more about those at the end. So, taking all this stuff, thinking about it, the next challenge I had is, well, how do I present to someone who wants to understand what we're getting into, what this might look like? I don't know about you, but a lot of people come to me and say, oh, we found this piece of software, the vendor says we can go live with it next week, it'll only cost X, can we sign up? And what I have to try and say to people is, well, you're starting the journey in the wrong place. So we came up with, and I won't go into this in any great detail, but you can have a copy of it, but it sort of pinches project methodology and planning and stuff. But it tried to outline on one page all the tasks, all the phases, and all the different elements that we would need to go through in order to get from the beginning to the end. So if you look at this and you jump right in at the sort of business readiness or go live, you realise you've missed out a whole load of steps earlier. We were able to use that to help the organisation understand that actually there were a number of things we needed to do back at each of these pieces. In yellow, I've just put what we sort of had in terms of governance of when we ran this project and the sort of pieces we need. And then at the very bottom, some general outputs of what the documents are that we would expect to come out of that. Now, this is all standard project stuff, so I don't claim to have rewritten prints or be a prints expert, but this was a roadmap, really. It was something that was a single page that really allowed us to communicate the big picture process, put the tasks in context, very much do the you are here approach so that the organisation could understand where it was. Helps you see what you need to do so you can think about all those things I mentioned earlier, plus all the resources you're going to need to bring together. And as I say, it's not a substitute for project management. So that's a whistle-stop tour of a sort of designing a process. It's, to recap, as I would say, be emotional about it to a certain extent. Make sure you can sort of feel what this thing is going to be like for your organisation. This is the way that I work. Some people don't like that. Some people have different learning styles or delivery styles. But I think as an IT person, I sometimes don't allow that sense of intuition or some of those feelings that I know to inform the decision as much as I should. So I'm sure you, coming from the arts, probably are much more empathetic than I am on some of those things, but I think it is important to do that. So the second piece was really to then look at, okay, we've got a sort of process that we're going to follow. How do we then tailor whatever we're going to buy to suit our business needs? And this really is, isn't it, the holy grail of why we do these things, because we want something that does everything at the click of a button without any effort. That's what all our organisation wants. The thing again that I mentioned was that, again, talking about the process, is tailoring a package doesn't sit in one particular piece. It doesn't sit in the contractual phase or the procurement phase. It actually spreads across the whole project, and you need to embed in your processes and in the way you think that tailoring process and how you're doing it, because it has a number of different dimensions as the project proceeds. So I'm just going to touch very quickly, using that previous picture I had of the various sections of where we thought about tailoring a package in the product when we were moving to SRO4, and some of the things we did to try and get us to the point where we were comfortable that this thing was going to do what we wanted when we went live. Obviously, capture business, I mean, that's a self-evident truth, isn't it? But again, capturing those is sometimes difficult. Sometimes you can do it formally, sometimes you've got lists of requests, sometimes you just got stuff. But right before you even get to having decided a solution, you need to get together a bucket, if you like, of all those good things before you formalise it particularly. The other thing that we did, and again it's sort of standard stuff, but we hadn't in a previous project invested enough time in it, was business process modelling. Sounds dull, but actually is invaluable because it allows you to describe your organisation. I'm sure most of you all have done it in one way or another. But we very much did our as-is processes to understand what the organisation was, and then modelled the to-be processes, because those became the absolute core, if you like, or the foundation of all the next steps as to how we were making sure that we were delivering what the business wanted and actually had some points of reference. It's interesting, isn't it? We found within our organisation that we had different people in different departments doing the same process very differently. We found that there was no controls over things. We found all sorts of anomalies going on. We found exceptions everywhere. You're not going to get rid of all those, and I'm sure you've probably got them in your organisation, but this at least helps give you a language that you can describe those particular concerns or issues to anyone who needs to know. And then the other thing, and I touched on it again earlier, is technical delivery options, cloud, in-house, outsourced. Again, at the moment, any vendor will come along to you and say they can run it in the cloud for you. Lovely, you don't need to worry about it, or you can put it on your servers. There's a whole series of risks and opportunities there. I think just from observation, I would say the one that gives you more control is probably doing it in-house if you've got the staff and resources. If you give it to someone else, it might make you feel comfortable when you give it to them. When things go wrong or you need to have some control over it, remember you're only as good as the person at the other end and the service levels or whatever you've negotiated. And actually you can't just send your techie down to press the box or reset it or find something. And again, for us on premise, because we're in a sort of, well, Whipsonade is in the middle of nowhere anyway, and London Zoo is not exactly well connected, it was more important for us to keep the technical infrastructure on the site, because if it went into the cloud and we lost the connectivity, I could do nothing. But again, these are all things that different organisations will have different costs, profile, risk issues and models to adopt. So that was some quick notes on planning. Find and select a solution. Yeah, I'm sure most of you have been through these processes. I think the first time we did this, when we moved from Omni tickets to Patron Engine Razor's Edge, we probably took about 6 months from starting the search and select process. So that was finding 20 systems, reducing them down to 12, then shortlisting them down to 6, doing the RFI, and then having got it down to 3 or 4, doing site visits. It goes on forever, and you come up with a winner at the end, and that's just the beginning of the project rather than the end. So these things can take a long time and can be expensive, but again, you need to think about how you're going to get there. One tool that we used, because we were looking at doing the upgrade to SR04, and we needed a sort of quick and ready answer without detailed process and endless documentation, was a gap analysis. So going back to our earlier thing, our business processes, we took our 2B processes and we gave them to Top Tick Triple at this time, and we said, right, we want to work with you on a very quick piece of work that matches your new functionality against those business processes, just to understand whether they can do what we want or whether they can't. And remember, we were hoping to get rid of Razor's Edge and artifacts, so SR04 had to demonstrate that it could do fundraising, it had to show that it could do high net worth donor management and a number of other processes that we're doing there, as well as the more complex and esoteric room bookings for education spaces where they need 3 teachers and some animals and a keeper and a classroom and lunches and teachers and all the rest of it. Another tool that we didn't use but you could use is a request for information. Vendors prefer that at an early stage than a full RFP in my experience. Full RFP of 20,000 line items they've got to tick isn't necessarily going to get their go. If you can give them what you want to do broadly with your processes, then they can come back to you with a more informed document. You may then want to go to an RFP situation, you probably will, but at least you're then getting the information you need to help you make the decision. Again, other things, demos, yeah, that's fairly obvious. I think the other key point, and this is about the tailoring the package really, is what is your appetite for the package, for having some money spent on customising it, or configuring it, or changing your processes to suit what the system does. And again, that's a discussion you need to have, but we took a view tried to take the view that actually we're not going to do any customisations. We're going to change the way we work to suit the way the system works, and we will configure as much as we can. In the end, we did need customisation, not a huge number. We did change the way we work, and we did do lots of work on tailoring it. But again, that's one of the key components, I think, isn't it, for understanding how it fits. And Nigel just made a good point about how systems are more like a gardening glove, these systems, rather than a silk glove. It roughly generally fits your hand rather than being a perfect fit. The procurement bit, so you've shortlisted, you've found the solution. Procurement, again, you'll all have processes and organisation or policies that you need to follow. I'm not a lawyer, this bit drives me up the wall. You always know when you look at the standard terms and conditions that the in-house legal team will probably argue over liability and warranties and all the things that you know aren't going to get changed, but they're still going to argue about them. So look at the software contract as the backstop, if you like. The other bits that I think you then need to get right, and we did on this particular thing, was have separate schedules for the customisation that we wanted done, and also the professional services days we needed for configuration. So that's not quite the word, for configuration of your solution. So again, tailoring it was part of that base package, plus some customisations, plus configuration. But you need the vendor to help you with that configuration piece, because it's their knowledge that you're going to be using and trying to build into your solution. Concentrate on processes for acceptances. Yeah, these are standard things. I'm sure you'll think about them. But again, try and think through the mechanisms that you're actually going to use in reality, not the abstract, what if we have to reach for the contract if it all goes wrong. Think of how you use those as tools, because once you've done the customisations, that bit of the contract is effectively no longer relevant. You've then moved on to the other terms and conditions. And the other thing that I think is always difficult is think through what the reality is going to be like when you're thinking of your service level agreements. So if you've been running systems before, think of the sort of problems you've got now, and then go back and think, how would this service level agreement fix them? I still do it, and I should know better, but you tend to look at service level agreements, and they're so far away from where you are in the project, you tend to just think, oh, they look fine. And it's only when you go live you suddenly think, what were these SLAs I signed up for, and are they actually relevant and appropriate for what we want? And the final thing, honest relationships. I think with top ticks, any vendor, there are going to be bumpy patches. If you're the ultimate owner of a solution delivering this, and you maybe got project managers and others working on it, you've got to have a dialogue with the top person. You've got to build a relationship that's going to allow you to go along and have a quiet word and say, look, this isn't working, this isn't going right, we've got to get it back on track. The last thing you want to do at any point in any of this activity is pick the contract up and start waving it around, because if you reach that point, then you haven't actually managed all the other points that you really need to get to. Unless the vendor is doing a really dreadful thing to you. Business change, so this is where you've now got the software, you're terribly excited, everyone sits down, they've turned it on, and off they go. And this, for me, is now where the real meat of what we did with SRO4 comes in. And it's this configuration. As you know, all these systems have a huge number of parameters and options that can be changed to do what you want. But you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. So you need the vendor to do it. And I think, don't underestimate, don't skimp if you're doing a budget on what you might need here. If you can, build in more than you think you need, because ultimately a day of a vendor telling you how to do stuff is probably going to lead to 2 or 3 days of in-house stuff that you want to do to play around. You may then want to go back and ask more questions. If you only built in a day, you haven't necessarily got that place to go. I think also be aware of the knowledge and what you're learning. So we, as part of this process, put together the users, the IT configuration team, and the vendor, and the business processes. So back to my 2B processes again. We worked through those in detail, and we had a scribe. The project manager did it. She wrote down every single point of configuration that we did and we discussed, and we built configuration manuals. So we were starting to capture that knowledge so that we had not only it in the heads of the people who were in the room at the time, but we had some evidence and something tangible at the end, so that when we said, why did we do that, or how about that, we had a bit more knowledge of it. And that really is about also the transition of knowledge from the vendor to you. And I go back to that first point I made about who do you want to run this project, you or the vendor. You need to be ultimately owning the solution and knowing how to do this stuff. If you rely on the vendor to come in and do it, and then the contract finishes and off they go, and you don't know what you're doing, you'll be struggling. Again, there's a cost in doing that, but be aware that's probably where you need to be. Out of our processes, out of our 2B processes, then other things dropped out quite naturally. So our standard operating processes and our training manuals, and the person who came in to do the business process mapping, she also did the training and the documentation and became very much of a guru on the whole thing, but was worth her weight in gold throughout the course of the project, and really was worth having that. Business readiness, it's getting near. You've done your configuration, you've sort of got your customizations, you've sorted out your patches, your hot fixes. There's a number of moving parts that are going on. You're not quite sure whether you're going to be ready. The business wants it all now. There are staff who aren't around. There are holidays. You've got to make sure now that you start testing it. Again, we use test scripts that were developed out of those 2B processes, and we concentrated on those as the testing process. So again, very much getting the users involved all the way through to say, does this do what you want to do your bit of the business? As I say, moving parts, there's lots of stuff going on. We did have some problems where you've got a fix and a bug fix and a new release and a version coming, and you've got to happen and test it before you can put it on to do it. So again, that's all part of your project management, but vendors will work with you on that, but you need to manage those as well, because it can be quite disruptive and can affect some of the timelines. One assumption that we made, and I'm a bit embarrassed to stand up and say it, but we did think that one or two pieces of the core functionality would work. We assumed other people had used them. They hadn't, they didn't. That gave us some challenges fairly late on in the project. So again, one builds in assumptions that you think are reasonable. Sometimes they don't always work out the way you want. And all I can say is, test. The problem, of course, that we all know is that the gap between getting to the point where you configured it and your go-live date may be getting narrower, which is where you're doing your testing. And what is it that gets thrown out? It's your testing. That's part of your risk management. You need to make informed decisions, but ultimately you've got to make a judgment call, because you get to this point where if you've got a fixed deadline, you've got to jump. How ready are you? What are your risks? Do you think you'll be all right? These are all things that you will have to make a call on. You hopefully have got the system to where you want to be, and you'll be able to go. The dilemma, just as an example for where we had to go live February, because beginning of February, it was then half term, 2 weeks after that. Then after half term, it was an early Easter. For us, we had to really have everything up and ready for February half term. Originally, we had thought of going after half term, but then we suddenly realised because Easter was much earlier this year than normal, that didn't give us enough window to be comfortable. So we actually had to bring our dates back by a couple of weeks, and that did hurt us on some of the testing stuff. But that's hindsight. At the point we reached on that date, was it the 1st of February this year, we sat down and we looked at all the risks, all the things that we thought we had got right, all the issues that we knew still had to solve, and we thought we have to do it. If we'd missed that window, we couldn't have gone live till probably September, October time, and the overrunning cost, just in terms of staff and resource and delay to the business, was huge. So you're in a bit of a quandary, but ultimately you have to make a decision. We jumped, and we went, oh, thank God we're going live. But of course, as you all know, business as usual, what a nice euphemism that is for when you've just launched a new project. It's not business as usual. It's a completely new business activity. It's a completely new way of running your organisation. And not only will your team, who have been working hard to get this thing going, know what they're doing, but they won't have seen it thrown at them from an operational point of view. They are suddenly going to be running and learning all the new operational issues that go on. And that takes time as well. They're not going to know the answer necessarily to all those esoteric questions that suddenly a user has. They may get them in a few months' time, but they're not necessarily going to answer them straight away. And we certainly felt that the operational needs of the organisation, once you've gone live, from our point of view of this project, was a bit of a tsunami, because we'd changed so many moving parts. And even though we'd done all the processes, we'd done all the testing, we'd done all the business cases, we still had that day one, someone rings up and goes, how do I do X? Well, you never asked how to do X. Oh, but I've got a customer on the phone, I've got to do it. You're immediately then into a management to manage that call, plus the other stuff that's coming. And again, you get a number of those, and we certainly found that the resources that we put in place that we thought we were going to be using to be planned in phase 2 were suddenly all coping with day-to-day stuff. And that certainly was, again, perhaps we should have known better, but I'll come on to it in a minute. It was something that did knock us for a week or two while we got our act together. I mean, to put it in context, we were still selling tickets, the business was still going, we only had 1 day's downtime while we swapped over, we were selling online, everything was working. It was just on the margins, there were things that people couldn't do that they wanted to do. And you get a number of people who, for them it's their job, they've got to do it now, and trying to tell them another priority because actually got some bigger issues to deal with can be quite challenging. But on the whole, the organisation was very supportive of us, and they waited, and we caught up fairly quickly, although we had, I think, now developed or generated a sort of bigger amount of work on an ongoing basis than we had originally anticipated. So, you've got to that point where you go on live and you think it's all fine. You've had your few weeks of your go live or your months or whatever, and you sit down and you do some lessons learned. And these, I've just picked out of our lessons learned document some points that were, these were real learnings for us, real things that I thought I'd just share with you. And I've sort of touched on most of them, but I will give you just a quick flavour. So, resources, go live, we didn't have enough resource, even though we had the vendor on site, even though I've got more people in the team than we previously had, we could have done with another 2 or 3 people for a month or 2. We didn't factor that into any of the planning, we didn't have a budget for it, but the reality is that the business would have benefited from it, and we should have probably anticipated that. Reporting, every vendor, every project I've ever been on, everyone goes, oh, there's a report writer, you can do whatever reports you want, it'll all be wonderful. Because you don't have the data and you haven't gone live with it, you don't necessarily know what that data will report on. As soon as you go live, everybody wants the report. If you don't know the data well enough to know that the report is exactly what they want, you've then got to have someone who's going to be able to do that. And again, we probably lost a bit of sight on that report writing side. And it not helped by some changes we made in our finance team as well, and we got rid of some key people who knew how the finance wanted the reports, and we had a difficult time. But again, reporting, a continual theme, just for the opinion it. Reconfiguration, that goes back to my whole issue about people ringing up and saying, but how do I do this if they haven't done it? We had to build in capacity to redo some of those codes and parameters and system setup. Optimum time to go live I've talked about, so you saw some of the challenges there. And then finally, this never be the first. How often do we say that? We didn't think we were quite the first, but we discovered we were the first on using some of the functionality and some of the things in the system, and that does come at a price in this particular case. So if you can avoid it, do it, but if you can't, then just be aware of what some of the challenges are. So that really has tried to distill sort of 2 years worth of work and a lifetime of project management and organisational stuff into just half an hour for you. I'm very conscious that a lot of you have probably done all this before, so I apologise if anything I've said is telling you what was blindingly obvious or that you already know about. But I thought it was useful to just share what process we went through and how we got there. I know there are other organisations, certainly Historic Royal Palaces, who have been in similar, Royal Collection and Historic Royal Palaces who have both been in
presentation.
Yeah. So perhaps we should learn something from that. And again, the final thing I would say, the whole process is about scale. If you're a small organisation, you're not going to have a lot of the resources to do that we did. But I think a lot of the issues that I raised are things you're going to have to think about. So even if you haven't got the resources, you've got to be aware that you've got to do quite a lot of the things. And if you haven't got the resources, should you be doing them in the first place if you can't do it? Anyway, that's what I had to say to you. So I'm only 1 minute away from your lunch, but I'm conscious you haven't had a break since 11 o'clock. So there is, I think, time for questions.